We are no longer dealing with speculative threats. We are analyzing a definitive, irreversible shift in the strategic reality of the war. The third battle for the light has begun, and for the first time, Russia will face a symmetrical, reciprocal response for every act of terror it commits. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. The key to understanding this new phase is the political decision made in Washington. For over 2 years, the fundamental paradox of this war was that Ukraine fought with self-imposed limitations, often withholding fire against legitimate military targets inside Russia due to the previous administration's strict directives. That era of unilateral restraint is definitively over. The current administration has formally eliminated the concept of a strategic sanctuary for Russia. The proof of this political pivot is now public and damning for the Kremlin. The green light was confirmed by high-ranking U.S. officials and key military figures. General Kit Kellogg stated unequivocally that the U.S. political leadership has granted authorization for Ukraine to use American-supplied resources for deep strikes against military assets inside Russia, and that unrestricted zones no longer exist. This phrase is the new operational doctrine. It explicitly removes the diplomatic shield that Russia relied upon to protect its command and control centers, its logistical hubs, and crucially, its energy generation infrastructure. This political resolution is a direct consequence of the Kremlin's calculated arrogance. Russia assumed it could wage its campaign of terror against Ukrainian power plants, hospitals, and homes with impunity. That assumption was wrong. The current Vice President, J.D. Vance, himself confirmed that it is Russia sabotaging peace talks, providing the political justification for a forceful response. The signal is clear. The most powerful nation in the world has publicly endorsed the principle of an eye for an eye. The strategic implications of this shift are now visible on the ground. The successful retaliatory strike on the Belgorod power grid was the immediate, undeniable proof of concept. Missiles targeted the local thermal power plant and a crucial substation, instantly plunging the city into darkness. This cascading failure, the loss of power, water, and even the ability of the governor to use the emergency siren systems was a direct demonstration that the logic of the war has changed. It is no longer about Ukraine's suffering in silence. It is about imposing a reciprocal cost on the aggressor. This is the most critical strategic development of the year. It has provided Ukraine with the political and military freedom to fight a war of reciprocal action. The ultimate cost of the terror campaign has now been imposed on the aggressor, proving that the price of aggression now applies to both sides. The era of Russia's unquestioned dominance over the escalation ladder is over. We've established the political authorization that redefined the conflict. Now we must analyze the immediate, devastating consequence of that decision, the symmetric response that has shattered the illusion of safety across the Russian home front. The attack on Belgorod was more than a tactical strike. It was a physical and psychological projection of the war's new, unforgiving reality. The core of this new doctrine is simple and brutal. For every act of terror committed against the Ukrainian civilian population, a proportional and calculated response will be delivered to the aggressor's territory. This is the eye for an eye principle applied to strategic warfare. The reality on the ground in Belgorod following the counterstrike was a comprehensive collapse of basic municipal functions, a direct parallel to the suffering endured by Ukrainian cities for 2 years. Missiles successfully struck the thermal power plant, TEC, and a critical substation, instantly causing a cascading failure that disabled the power supply across the regional capital.
The subsequent chaos was a public confession of the state's incompetence. The loss of electricity immediately disabled the water supply because the pumping station ceased to function. Traffic lights failed, creating logistical snarls, and the emergency missile warning systems were compromised, a terrifying admission by the local governor that the state could no longer guarantee the most basic security warnings. This is the moment the war ceased to be an abstraction and became a visceral daily fear for the Russian populace. They are now facing the same systemic vulnerabilities that their military relentlessly exploited in Kyiv and Kharkiv. The psychological impact of this symmetry is the most damaging element for the Kremlin. For 2 years, the propaganda machine successfully sold the narrative that the war was distant and that the terror could be outsourced. The Belgorod strike shattered that illusion, replacing it with panic. The state is now forced to confront its own population's anxiety, which erodes the legitimacy built on the promise of stability. This internal shock is further compounded by the realization that their formidable layered air defense system, the pride of the Russian military, is irrelevant against a precise, low-altitude counterstrike aimed at a soft civilian target like a power plant. The defense was configured for high-value military threats and has been easily bypassed by a strategic weapon targeting the civilian Achilles heel. This single strike immediately forces the Russian high command into an agonizing strategic no-win scenario. To prevent future blackouts in vital regions, they must divert scarce S-400 and Buk air defense batteries away from the front lines and strategic military assets. Every battery pulled back to protect a substation is a unit no longer available to defend against Ukrainian ground assaults or to protect missile depots. This strategic diversion, mandated by the successful strike on Belgorod, is the most profound military cost of the retaliatory campaign. It proves that the price of the war is no longer negotiable. It is a compulsory, accelerating tribute being paid by the Russian state to its own aggression.
We have established the devastating effect of the symmetrical response on the Russian home front. But the true long-term strategic threat has its origin in the political shift in Washington, the potential transfer of weapons like the Tomahawk cruise missile. This isn't just about adding a new piece of hardware to Ukraine's inventory. It is the definitive moment that the military balance fundamentally shifts, giving Ukraine an asymmetric, non-negotiable capability that completely nullifies Russia's remaining strategic sanctuary. The reports are clear and constitute a severe, escalating warning to the Kremlin. The transfer of a weapon like the Tomahawk with a range exceeding 2,500 kilometers, about 1,550 miles, fundamentally obliterates the Kremlin's core defense doctrine, the use of Russia's vast geography as a strategic shield. A missile with this capability puts every major Russian military, industrial, and energy center in European Russia, from the Ukrainian border to the Ural Mountains, under direct and immediate threat. Its sophisticated guidance systems and low-altitude flight profile, when paired with the real-time intelligence now provided by the US, turn it into a virtual certainty to reach its target. This is the ultimate weapon of deterrence, a devastating tool that can impose an unbearable cost on the aggressor without requiring a massive, costly Air Force operation. The strategic consequence of introducing such a weapon is devastating for Russia's defense planning. The Kremlin must now allocate its already strained air defense assets to protect civilian infrastructure across thousands of square miles of its heartland, systems that were previously focused only on the front. This is a defensive dilemma with no solution. Russia's air defense system, as proven by the Tu-141 and drone strikes, is already inadequate against low-flying targets. Adding a sophisticated cruise missile like the Tomahawk to Ukraine's arsenal forces the Russian command to pull critical S-400 and Buk units from the front line just to defend non-military targets like power plants and major rail hubs. This is a massive, system-wide drain on resources and a direct subtraction from the military's ability to wage an offensive war. This potential transfer is being cemented by massive long-term industrial commitments that underscore the seriousness of the U.S. pivot. The proposed $90 billion arms procurement deal and the agreement to establish joint drone manufacturing are proof of a profound long-term commitment. The West is no longer simply providing stopgap supplies. It is permanently investing in Ukraine's military-industrial self-sufficiency. This means that within a few years, Ukraine will be able to replenish and upgrade its deep strike capabilities independently, creating a permanent, credible threat to Russia's vital infrastructure. This is the ultimate defeat for Russia's military strategy, which was predicated on outlasting and exhausting its neighbor. The ultimate aim of this strategic escalation is to force Russia into an impossible choice. With the threat of the Tomahawk looming, Ukraine can now hold any critical Russian target at risk. The Kremlin must now weigh the political and economic fallout of continuing its terror campaign against the certainty of a devastating, unanswerable retaliatory strike on a major industrial center. This is a weapon of deterrence and a clear signal that the war will end only when Russia agrees to terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. The era of Russia's unquestioned dominance over the escalation ladder is over, replaced by a new, brutal reality where the financial and military consequences of its aggression are no longer negotiable.
We have analyzed the political permission and the devastating military consequence of the Tomahawk threat. Now we must turn to the ultimate strategic objective of Ukraine's counter-campaign, exposing and dismantling the single most critical, unreplaceable component of the entire Russian state, its highly vulnerable energy grid. The strike on Belgorod was merely a warning shot. The true existential danger lies in the threat of a systemic multi-regional collapse of this infrastructure. The fragility of Russia's energy system is the direct result of decades of neglect, corruption, and the crippling effect of international sanctions. This is the country's Achilles heel. The network is vast and sprawling, yet it relies on a finite number of massive, irreplaceable components. The large power transformers, LPTs. An LPT is a colossal piece of equipment, often weighing upwards of 300 tons and costing tens of millions of dollars. It is the core functional unit of the power grid, responsible for stepping up the voltage to immense levels so electricity can be transmitted over thousands of kilometers. Without LPTs, power cannot be distributed, and the entire grid fractures. The fragility is not theoretical, it is absolute and quantifiable. Due to the failure to modernize and the current sanctions regime, Russia has almost no domestic capacity to quickly replace these units. An LPT takes well over a year to manufacture under normal circumstances, and acquiring the necessary specialized components from the West is now politically and logistically impossible. This creates a critical weakness that Ukraine is strategically exploiting. Expert military analysis has determined that destroying a mere 70 of these critical LPTs would be enough to cause a cascading multi-regional failure across European Russia. This is not about a temporary blackout in one district, it's about plunging vast industrialized sections of the country into darkness and crippling the ability to sustain key military industrial production. This structural decay is compounded by the internal contradictions of the state. The crisis is forcing the political leadership to choose between two catastrophic options. They must decide whether to continue the terror campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure and risk a devastating, unanswerable strike on their own energy grid, or stop the aggression and concede a major political defeat. The Kremlin's fear is that the threat of a Tomahawk strike, a weapon capable of hitting the LPTs deep within Russian territory, is not a deterrent against a localized enemy, but a direct threat against the central government's viability. The strategic reality is that the vastness of Russia, which the Kremlin relies on as a geopolitical shield, suddenly becomes its greatest liability. The long transmission lines and sparse network of LPTs are the perfect target for a long-range, highly precise strike.
The successful strike on the Belgorod TEC was the proof of concept, a demonstration that the threat is not localized to border regions. The threat of the LPT collapse is the ultimate pressure point, raising the cost of the war to an unbearable existential level. The panic in the Kremlin is justified because the threat is no longer theoretical. It is a strategic certainty designed to force a political surrender.
We have meticulously chronicled the tactical strikes, the strategic vulnerabilities, and the seismic political shift that defines the new phase of this conflict. Now, we deliver the final, unavoidable conclusion. The war is no longer a matter of military attrition. It is a battle of political and economic will, and Russia has been forced into a corner by the inescapable logic of retaliation, a logic it cannot afford to ignore. The core reality is that the era of Russian impunity is definitively over. For years, the Kremlin's war strategy was based on a fundamental assumption of safety, that they could inflict terror on Ukrainian power grids and civilian populations while their own infrastructure remained untouchable. The successful strike on the Belgorod TEP was the moment that assumption was politically and physically shattered. This was not a localized raid. It was a clear declaration that the eye for an eye doctrine is now the official and fully supported policy of the Ukrainian defense. This doctrine has fundamentally shifted the cost of aggression. The price of every missile launched at a Ukrainian TEP is now the calculated risk of a devastating counterstrike on a Russian regional center. This new military reality is inextricably linked to the political decision-making in Washington. The political authorization to strike deep into Russian territory has erased the sanctuary the Kremlin thought it had secured. The threat of Tomahawk missiles and the acceleration of military aid are not just symbolic. They are weapons of strategic deterrence. They force Russia to choose between two catastrophic options: risk a devastating, unanswerable strike on its industrial heartland, or stop the aggression and concede a major political defeat. The Kremlin's fear is that the threat of the LPT collapse is the ultimate pressure point, raising the cost of the war to an unbearable existential level. The entire stability of the Russian state is now held hostage to the restraint of its own military command. The structural weakness of the Russian state, which has been exposed by corruption and the failure to modernize its energy grid, is the final element in this crisis. The government cannot quickly replace the massive, custom-built power transformers, LPTs, needed to maintain its vast power grid. This technical fact converts a military threat into an economic inevitability. Ukraine is now capable of triggering a systemic, multi-regional energy collapse, a crisis that would cripple the military-industrial complex and shatter social stability in key cities far from the front. The war will end because Russia cannot afford the reciprocal costs. The failure of the Russian leadership to adapt has been met with a devastating counter-strategy that targets the very viability of the state. The victory will be secured not by a conquest of Moscow, but by the moment the Kremlin realizes it can no longer pay the price for its own aggression. This realization, forced by the logic of retaliation, is the mechanism that will ultimately bring the conflict to an end on terms dictated by Kiev.